Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, a few months ago, the U.S. began to make serious overtures in South Korea, which escalated tensions with their neighbors in the north. And in response, they and other adversaries of the U.S. threatened to deliver arms that included nuclear weapons to a number of allied nations that included Venezuela. So the questions we really have to explore here are how much of a viable reality is this scenario? And what does it mean for the U.S. as it stands upon the doorstep of Caracas?
Yeah, it's been an interesting kind of few months because there was this belief that the United States was just going to roll up into Venezuela, seize control, and that would be the end of that. Well, reality is always somewhat different, not least because Venezuela is not a country that the United States can easily invade. It doesn't have the forces to do so. And the Venezuelans have made their point very clear that if you want a guerrilla war, come to Venezuela. It will turn into Vietnam on steroids. It'll be way worse than Vietnam for the United States. And we have to be careful in our assertions, but there are noises coming out of Washington that they're not really keen now on invading, as it were, Venezuela. And that is probably, from the US's perspective, a very smart decision. There is ongoing claims regarding the US that they're forcing Maduro to step down and claims he's prepared to step down in a year or 2 years. They want him to step down now and they're giving him ultimatums. There's no evidence to support that. And he still has huge support amongst the people. Contrary to claims in the West, he also has huge support from the Ukrainian, Venezuelan military, which obviously is something that has allowed him to survive previous attempts to remove him from power via other failed attempts at what you might term color revolutions. So the question always has been, though, with regards to Venezuela, is what has Venezuelan allies given Ukraine in terms of military support, military hardware, other logistical support, financial aid, etc., etc. And that's something that the United States seems to have largely ignored. And in varying ways, this has allowed Venezuela to survive enormous economic and financial difficulties. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that the country themselves are not to blame for some of their problems, because they are. But if you're heavily sanctioned, you will largely struggle to survive those sanctions for any long period of time. The only country really in the world who's managed to do that very successfully is Iran. But they're the exception that proves the rule. We know without a doubt that Venezuela has signed major cooperation deals with China and Russia, and that's been economic help, military help, and therefore on that basis that the United States isn't aware to what extent Venezuela has, air defense systems to protect itself, other missile technology, also to what extent it's now able to defend itself with drones, because we have absolutely know that Russia has been flying in military aircraft which are designed to carry equipment, hardware. To what extent and to what degree that Russia's providing that support in recent years is not clear. But the United States has to be aware of this and realize that potentially Venezuela has technology that could cause the United States immense damage, not least in terms of its maritime presence now off the coast of Venezuela and in the broader Caribbean sort of region. The same applies also with China, but China has been buying enormous amounts of energy from the Venezuelans. There's a big tie-up between Venezuela and Rosneft, etc., etc. So that alone provides significant support that would allow Venezuela to be not a pushover, as the United States might perceive to be the case. The question, which we'll come on to shortly, is what about other nations who have clearly made overtures and noises about supporting Venezuela? What have they potentially given them? And what could that mean for the United States? And by extension, the broader region, because if Venezuela possesses military hardware, military technology that potentially could be devastating for the United States, then it changes the whole dynamic of this idea that the US was just going to get rid of Maduro, and then clearly the president-elect they want in, who's going to be hugely sympathetic to the United States, what a surprise, would be a formality. Well, it absolutely isn't a formality.
I think one of the most important things to really take a look at as well is we've seen both from the Ukraine conflict, we've seen from the tariff and trade battles, et cetera, that the Trump administration and even the president himself quite often use rhetoric that is absolute, outright lies, deception, etc. I don't know how many times where the president has come out and said, we've made a deal and they're going to give us X, Y, and Z, and it's been absolutely nothing, absolute garbage. So when it comes to Venezuela and things such as recently over the late last week and into this weekend, that President Trump has given Maduro till Friday to leave Caracas and the government and get out of there. Well, Friday's come and gone. We're now into Tuesday the next week, and nothing has happened. We have the instance where Trump is declaring a no-fly zone over Venezuela. Well, why would he suddenly do this? It has to pose the question: are there arms and allies of Venezuela getting things in there to bolster their defenses and help prepare? That is a legitimate thing, especially when you have to take a look at the fact that a war or a conflict with Venezuela, it's one thing having a covert operation to do regime change. That's nothing new in the U.S. pantheon of diplomatic policy. But when it comes to having a lot of your military sitting there in the Caribbean ready to allegedly attack, where you're doing flyovers to try to spook the Venezuelan people into, forcing Maduro out of there. And then, of course, you've got that opposition leader who just won, the Nobel Prize, screaming about how she will do this, this, and this for the United States. So just get me into office and I'll give you everything. It almost seems like it's more a war on propaganda with a little bit of tantalizing, military bravado just outside. But you hit the nail on the head. The United States does not have the capability to do a on boots on the ground or any type of war or conflict, because there are so many allies that have seen and support Venezuela and recognize what losing Venezuela, leaving it isolated would do. And you have to deal not just with somebody like North Korea. Pakistan has made overtures. Iran, of course, has had to deal with the United States interfering with them. And now, they want to provide support to Venezuela. So we're seeing also, the final straw is that there is a division within the people of the United States. They are not for this. And it's even to the point that it is breaking apart and dividing the political cohesion of quote unquote MAGA, where you have congressmen in the Republican side who don't want this, where you have the people themselves that don't want a conflict. They don't believe the rhetoric about Venezuela being a narco capitalist, all or narco trafficker, et cetera, they know that this is really about other objectives. So it's going to be very, very, very difficult for President Trump to actually make that step and do something legitimate, whether trying to take out the Maduro or to do boots on the ground. And with that being the case, it's like with North Korea, go back to 2019. President Trump decided that he wanted to make friends with Kim Jong-un because they have the nuclear deterrent. And so Venezuela and even Iran at some point recognize this is how you deal with the bully, is you have the means to hit them in the nose, hurt them, and that's how you keep them out of browbeating you and being the bully and forcing you into concessions you really don't want.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you look at the relationship that Venezuela has with Iran, that again is shrouded in mystery. And the United States is not in a position to understand the extent of that relationship. But it's interesting if you look at the Iranian Foreign Ministry, only recently condemned, obviously, the actions of the US in the Caribbean and announced that it was expanding cooperation, note at bilateral, which is obvious with Venezuela, but multilateral levels. What does that mean? Does that include with the Chinese and the Russians? No one knows. So therefore, and this is a huge problem. Excuse me. The other thing with regards to bilateral relations, which is not well known in the West, is Turkey has pretty strong relations with them. That's been the case for decades. I mean, yes, it's been largely economic, but there is concern as to what support the Turks have provided. But perhaps the biggest wild card in all this is North Korea. Because North Korea possesses nuclear weapons, there is a belief, and I first heard this about a year ago, that, excuse me, Venezuela was in receipt, or was believed, shall we say, to be in receipt of nuclear weapons from North Korea. Now, this could be total nonsense, but does the United States want to take that risk? Rather like the United States doesn't want to take the risk that North Korea has them. Maybe it's a big bluff call. Maybe they don't have it at all. But if you're thinking that's a possibility, then that must surely change your mind with respect to how you approach Venezuela, which is why they'd rather have a soft coup. Maduro goes because they don't want to have to push the point militarily because they don't know what they're dealing with.
In a number of different instances as well. You mentioned last year that you've heard rumblings about, North Korea and Venezuela getting together, over potential nuclear weapons, whatever. This question has been even broached by some in the uh, academia going back to 2019, where there was an article about Iran, Venezuela, and North Korea's nukes. So this is, the one thing also that stands out is Trump has been probing. His biggest adversary, it seems at this point, is BRICS. And Venezuela, while not a fully, fledged BRICS member, they are legitimately someone, especially as part of OPEC Plus, who has much greater leanings towards the BRICS nations and that independence, that de-dollarization, than they do being a vassal of the Monroe Doctrine and all of North and South America, the Western Hemisphere. So Trump has already gone after India to try to pull them away from China and Russia, that cohesion. Now we have different areas where the United States has been trying to break apart BRICS, one little facet at a time, usually with the ancillary countries. You have to think that his recent meeting with MBS and Saudi Arabia was about to try to ensure that they remain under the U.S. hegemony and don't move towards being part of BRICS. So I think there's much more geopolitical uh, consequences to this rather than the big, fallacy that they're trying to stop drugs, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, of course, that's just a smokescreen. We know that. But interestingly, of course, is for the United States a big problem because relations between the US and Colombia are not exactly rosy at the moment. And there is a feeling there are elements inside Colombia, like FARC, who would be gunning to have a guerrilla war with the United States and piling over the border into Venezuela, which, of course, Colombia shares a border with. So there are numerous potential issues here for the United States to face, including regional support. Okay, there are Cuba. Well, Cuba's a bit of a wild card in itself, knowing what it could potentially do. So the US is having to rethink its strategy because it just doesn't know what it's up against. But the problem for the US is they're frequently very impatient. And when things aren't happening quickly enough, they tend to do things that are rather irrational, potentially not the right decision to make. But if, and people say, I don't believe it, well, if you're faced with decision making and consequences of your behavior, then you're going to think twice if you even suspect that that Venezuela may have weapons. Maybe it's tactical nuclear weapons. Maybe they don't have them, but if they have them, what could they potentially do with them? Now, of course, the argument would be if they do that, then Venezuela is going to suffer total devastation. But the problem is, if they do and they caused huge damage to the United States, the US's reputation would be sunk. That would be the end of the US's any belief as an hegemonic power, which is rapidly diminishing anyway. But it's a huge problem, and there's no doubt it's got the United States extremely worried, and rightly so, because they don't know what potentially Venezuela possesses, whether it's from the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, the Turks, the North Koreans, but also what potentially Colombia might do. And also, Venezuela is not a country that you can just conquer. It is going to turn into a guerrilla war, and the United States will lose and lose very badly. So if they're not in a position to launch any form of invasion or military action, then and they threaten Maduro and he just ignores them, then what does the US do? And again, the longer this drags on, then the US looks weak, and it just ferments in the minds of many global South countries that the US is now the naked emperor, and it increasingly, of course, is. But it'll be interesting as things unfold. But yeah, this idea that it's about dealing with narco trafficking is there may be some grain of truth to it, but it's largely an excuse. But there is an interesting dilemma with regards to trading and what that might mean for the United States in the future. But I will park that discussion for another day because potentially this could also have an enormous ramifications for the US with respect to that. If indeed there is a grain of truth to what the US is proposing to do, and there might actually be domestic reasons why they're doing it, but the excuse with regards, excuse me, to Maduro, of course, is nonsense.
Yeah, and there's always that um, the obvious thing about the oil, because when you take a look at the United States, they want to drill off California, but they can't. They want to drill off the Gulf, but they can't. They want to get access to Alaska, but they can't. The cost basis for shale is pretty much null and void. So without really an energy source, and especially since the Trump administration has decided to go full bore into AI and data centers, if they don't have really access to an abundant source, then everything that they want to try to implement is going to go fall like dominoes. Any final thoughts you wanted to add to this, Paul?
No, that's fine.
To everybody here at the Sirius Report community, as always, thank you for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.